Hello and welcome once again to the Modern Maker Workroom. In this Season 3 episode, we are going to start looking at the construction of the skirts that go with this outfit that we're making. So we've made our stays, we've made our hip roll, and now we are moving on to the skirt and the petticoat. And their construction is very similar. So what I'm going to do is I will show you how to make one of them with the sewing machine, and then I'll show you how to make the overskirt by hand. That way you have information on how to do both of them. We'll start with the pattern, and after that we'll move on to the cutting. Now these skirts are quite a bit more involved than you'd think. For the most part, when we make historical skirts from a modern costumer's perspective, they're quite simple affairs. They have gathering at the waist. Sometimes if they're cartridge pleated, they might have a little bit of padding at the top. But since we're going to be doing simple gathers the way they would have done in the time period, we're not going to be putting any big header in the top of it. We are going to be using a hem stiffener. We're going to be facing the hem rather than folding the hem up and stitching it in place, which is a very modern kind of skirt treatment. In the time period, most things you can see, if you can see a hem in a painting, you see that it's faced. If you see a hem in a museum, you are likely to see that it's been stiffened with a piece of canvas or a piece of wool. There's usually some kind of tuck involved to adjust the height, balance, or to give extra stiffness. There's so many reasons why these skirts are much more heavily constructed than we ever give them credit for. So, without further ado, let's get busy. Let's get your rulers and your paper out, ready to draft. You'll need a Bara tape for the waist measurement, and you'll need a Bara tape for the length measurement. We only really use those two while we're working because that's really all we're concerned about. We add a little bit of extra length to account for a hip roll. So that we just adjust in a fitting, and I'll show you how to do that when we get around to that video. So thank you so much for joining us in the Modern Maker Workroom. I'm Matthew Nagy. Let's get stitching. Begin by laying out your drafting paper on your tabletop. And first thing we always do is to mark out the full length of whatever it is that we're drafting. In this case, I'm using the length tape, and I'm measuring 1 1/3 bara. So that is BT in notation. And I'm making good solid marks with this nice Sharpie. Typically I don't draft in Sharpie, but I want you to be able to see my lines on the camera. So then I will set aside the length tape for the moment, and I pick up the waist tape, and you'll see me here measuring perpendicular to the line I just drew. And I want about 3 times fullness in the waist of this skirt, so I'm drafting this at 3/4 of the waist tape. So that's Q, Q, Q for 3/4. And then I'm using the same tape to make a couple of marks here that will demarcate what I'm doing for the height of the back waist, and then what I'll do for the height of the front waist. The front waist is typically dropped below the back waist, and really depending on what the draft is and the kind of skirt, this could be 1/12 of the waist measurement, which would be D, or it could be as much as 1/8, which is O on the tape. Either way, you'll set the curves of the waist like this. I'm using a relatively high back because I know it has to go over the size of the bum roll, and then I'll drop the front waist a little bit lower later on. Now I'm also drafting the side seam right now, and this I'm just doing by eye for whatever width looks right to my eye in proportion to the waist and the length. But you may also use the pattern out of the book, which gives you a very specific width for the hem. In Spain, they actually had some regulations at one point about the number of hand spans a skirt could be across the bottom. I tend to ignore that and just go in favor of a proper proportion. So I've marked out the length of the side seam. I've marked the new front waist drop because my first line just didn't seem deep enough to me, so I wanted to make it a little longer. And at this point, I've got 1/8 of the waist tape is the depth of the front waist. I'll use my straight edge here to draw the side seam, and then I need to move on to drawing the bottom curve. Now this I'm just doing with a dashed line to start off with because I find that my eye has an easier time following this dashed line and making a nice smooth curve because I'm breaking it up into chunks, and then I'll just trace over it with a solid line. And the pattern is mostly done. The next thing that I'm going to do though is I'm going to make some notations of what my measurements were when I drew this. So I just put the 3/4 at the waist, and then I'm just labeling the length here as Bara and 1/3. And I'm measuring the width along the bottom, and I'm measuring the width with the length tape because I always like to have the length in proportion to the width. And it looks like I've got Bara and 1/4 along the bottom here. I think that's an excellent size to have. Now I need to finish labeling the pattern. I also am going to make a line showing where the typical width of a 54-inch wide cloth would be. So I'm making a mark at 27 inches from the center front, which will be cut on the fold, and then I'm just going to draw this line here, and that gives me kind of an idea of where the seam might need to be. And in the case of if I'm practicing to be able to draft directly onto the fabric, then I could even go so far as to measure lengths and widths of this piecing so that I can memorize that and have something much closer and easier to draft. This line that I'm drawing here will be the grain line, so that needs to be in line with the straight grain of the fabric. In the professional business, we actually will put the pattern piece down on the cloth, and then we'll measure from either the fold of the cloth or the selvage of the cloth at each end of that line so that we make sure that we are absolutely on the straight grain. I'm also labeling this pattern so that there's record of what it's meant to be and what it's for, and how many panels to cut as well. Now in this spot, I'm taking the length tape and I'm just measuring 1/4 of the tape down along the side, and this is for the skirt opening. This style of skirt has a center front and center back fold, so the openings are at the side. It will be a split waistband so that it overlaps slightly at the sides, which allows for a woman to change shape and go up and down in size quite a little bit. This is particularly useful for women who are of childbearing age and need to accommodate in their clothes ways for it to adjust. So I'm cutting this out, and you'll see that I did 2 cuts at the top. I cut a little bit along the front waistline, and then I cut all the way across the back waistline at the top. And that's just so that I can use the one pattern piece as I'm laying it out on the fabric, instead of having to draft a second one with a different waistline. So here we go, and we'll move on to cutting. As you can see, I have my wool cloth folded in half along its length and placed on the table. It's been pressed a couple of times. There's still a couple of wrinkles in it, but that's just from sitting on my bench. It's been pressed and shrunk with a steam iron. Now you'll notice that I flipped the pattern over face down, and I'm putting the wide end of the skirt toward the cut edge. Now this is a typical philosophy that you see in all of the historical layouts, as it's the beginnings of a conservation cutting system, in that you want to cut the largest pieces first, and you should always cut the widest edge of the pattern toward the cut end of the fabric when you're beginning your layout. And that's just because you leave more space toward the interior of the cloth as you work your way into it, which gives you more room for smaller pieces to be cut. If you'll have a look at my pattern, You can see the line that I drew at the 27 inches, assuming that the fabric was going to be 54 inches wide, which is a typical width for most of the synthetic and silk brocade fabrics. But seeing as this is a plain wool flannel, there's quite a bit more room available on the cloth. So you can see that it's almost 4 inches larger. So this is closer to, I would say, 58 or 60 inches wide, 58 usable inches for sure. So that line has moved, but at least I have it there as some kind of guideline. Now I've just laid the pattern down and weighted the edge, and now I'm just using a piece of chalk to go around it. And I had picked up my pencil so that I could mark the new placement of the wedge shape at the side. Since I'm drawing the back of the skirt, I'm going to go ahead and use the straight part of the pattern right across the top, and then I'll work my way down the side. I've walked around to the other side of my table here, and I'm just chalking in the side seam, and then I will follow up with figuring out the little wedge, the piecing that goes on to complete the size of the skirt. Now I know many people who for some reason are not comfortable with piecing, so they would just as soon pull the edge of that in so that the skirt panel is only as wide as the cloth. And I think that really shortchanges the silhouette quite a bit. I think the piecing is a very historically accurate construction method. I love the way it utilizes the fabric, and you can use almost all the square inches with very, very little waste. So I'm drawing a line on the pattern to match where the stitching line will go on the pattern piece, because we're just drawing a line on the internals in the middle of this pattern, so we don't really have seam allowance included. So I'm adding that as I chalk it out. So then what I do is I flip the pattern over, and I can just nest this pattern piece in and chalk it in place. It's a very simple process, and you can really see how little waste there is when I do this. I'm almost using a perfect rectangle of the cloth. There's only this tiny little sliver that is wasted. So the next thing that I'll do is I will move this pattern piece down the fabric, and I'll repeat the process, but I will follow the front waistline that I drew on the pattern instead of the back waistline. Once this portion of layout is complete, then I have to use my ruler and draw in all of the little bits which don't have pattern pieces for them. Now, I could have made pattern pieces for everything like the waistband and the facings that are going to go in the opening along the sides, but they're small, basic rectangles. They're not the kinds of things that you need a pattern for, and they can be cut from the scrap. Now, I'm cutting everything pretty wide, all things considered, quite wide, and then I will trim away excess width as I need to. I believe that waistbands of the time period, especially in the 17th century, leading into the styles that became the 18th century norm, I believe that the waistbands were quite small, more like bindings at the top that you could fasten closed rather than these wide stiffened waistbands that we're accustomed to using today. So I just drew a straight line, and then I used 3 of my own fingers to just gauge the width going along, and then whatever width that is, it will be enough. And then I drew the ends, and I'll pin that in place. I want to make sure that the waistband is going to be the correct length, so I'm using the waist tape, and I'm measuring M plus D. Now, I know that it looks like on that tape measure I just measured MDI, but trust me, it's MD because that end of the tape measure is a little inaccurate. It is supposed to be M plus D, and that gives a little bit of overlap plus seam allowances at the end. Then we're doing 2 waistbands. We're doing a front waistband and a back waistband, and together they'll be slightly more than the waist measurement, and that allows for them to be overlapped at sides. And the nice thing about having side opening as well is that if you are wearing pockets on the inside, which will be underneath the skirts, it gives you easy access to them without having to cut slits into the skirt itself. So now I have my scissors going, the cutting has begun. So I have the waistband cut out now, and I am going to mark it. So you see me just folding it in half right here, and then I'm just going to make two small clips, one in each side, and that lets me know where the center front and the center back of those waistbands belongs, and I can match that up to the center fronts and center backs of the skirt. Next, I'll just keep working my way down the cloth, cutting the waistline of the front of the skirt. And there's no magic to it, just follow the lines and slice right through them. I have been trained to think about cutting the line as cutting the line off, but when you have two pieces that are butted up against each other like this, then your goal is to cut as much in the middle of the line as possible. Okay, so the wedge and the top of the front are cut. Now all that remains is for me to shift this down and cut the hem, and then the front is cut out and ready to go. And then I'll just repeat this for the back. The next important step is to cut the stiffening layer for the hem of the skirt. The fast and easy way to do this is just to take the pattern and lay it along the torn edge of this fabric, and then just swing it around so that I know how long it needs to be. And then I double that width because this is only half of the skirt itself. And then I'll just tear a bunch of strips off. So you can see me figuring out how long it needs to be. I've got my fingers here that I'm just using for the width. I'm using 3 fingers width for the strip. And you can see I'm just laying my fingers along the edge and making a mark with the chalk. And I'll do this a couple of times just to sort of train my eye to the width of the strip. But then I'll just clip along the edge of the fabric and keep tearing. Now, all told, I'll probably need 5 or 6 of these to go around the hem. And it'll probably give me a little bit left over at the end as well. Once I have all the marks down, all I need to do is just clip the end of the fabric and tear. Now, this fabric I'm using here is a heavier weight linen, but it's still tearable. And pardon me, it's still able to be torn. And just to even it out before I stitch it on, I'll actually go to the iron and just press out the edges so that it's nice and crisp. But I'm tearing the second strip here, as you can see, and then I'll make a little pile of them and keep them nice and organized. And at the very end, I'll fold everything up and put it together in kind of a nice little package. For our next step, we'll need to cut the facings. And for this, I've dug out a small piece of silk that I'm going to use. It's a nice color, and if for any reason it should peek out while the outfit is worn, it's a color that will go nicely with the rest of the textiles. This, I'm going to be a little bit more precise about this, I think, than I was with the linen. This I'll actually cut carefully just because it's silk, and when silk is torn, it tends to leave a bunch of very hairy edges, which are pretty inconvenient when you're trying to work. Like the filaments of silk kind of get all over everything and tangle in the work, and it's very annoying. I'm going to cut this somewhat wider than the linen strips. So here I'm using 4 fingers, the full palm width, and I'll just mark that along and then connect all of these points with a straight line. Okay, and then I will copy that width a few times over and cut myself more strips. This portion will go much faster than cutting the silk or tearing the linen. This is the wool. Now this is the stiffener that we're going to be using for the skirt on the outer layer. So this is for the overskirt, not just the petticoat. I'm going to keep this fairly narrow, I think. The facing may be a bit deeper, but the stiffener itself doesn't need to be particularly wide. And one of the reasons for that is that I don't want to add too much weight if I can avoid it. I need the stiffness and the structure, but I don't want it to be too wide because I just don't want it to be too heavy. Now I happen to have some leftover strips from a previous skirt that I had made, so I'm just dividing those down into the width that's going to be most useful for me in this project. So if you have some scraps left over from a heavier garment that you've made in the past, it just needs to be a little bit spongy and it needs to be thick. Those are the important attributes. Now that we have our hem stiffener cut for the outer skirt, the overskirt, we need to cut our facings, and we're going to treat this exactly the same way that we treated the facings for the petticoat. This is a heavier weight linen with a little bit of a shine to it. It is not the same as the linen that I cut for the stiffener for the skirt, for the underskirt. Anyway, so you saw me use the full hand width, just exactly the same as we did for the silk that is going on the petticoat. And I'm just going to chalk a line and give it a cut. And we'll just use that same piece again and again as the guide so that we can cut the rest of them. Now that we're done with all of the cutting, I'm just going to organize my piles a little bit. The pale blue is my petticoat, and this rusty burgundy color is the overskirt. So I'm going to use the heavier wool for the overskirt. There we go. And then I'm going to use that for the facing, and I put together the pale linen or the pale blue with its linen strips and the silk. As I prepare to stitch everything together, I just want to take a look at what I cut. Now for this petticoat, one of my side wedges ended up needing to be cut in several pieces just to conserve fabric. So this 3-section wedge now needs to be assembled before I can attach it to the big part. So this will be done with French seams. You can see that I've already done one. Now the French seam is a little awkward because you always have to sew the seam to the outside first. Now I do this very delicately with a 1/8 inch seam allowance, and then when I turn it to the other side, then I'll use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. That means that total I'll end up with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, which tends to be about what I calculate with. So you'll see here now, before I stitch the second pass, I've opened it up and I'm just using my fingernail to crease this fabric. It's a nice fabric that seems to fold well by hand. And it just saves me time getting up to have to go to the iron to work. So now I'll do the second pass, and I'm trying to make sure that I get this very tight and snug while at the same time folding the fabric in just the right way. Now this one we'll stitch at a 1/4 inch so that it's just slightly bigger than the previous seam allowance, and that should give us a nice tidy French seam. So this is now the inside. So the first pass is stitched to the outside, and this pass is stitched to the inside. And the beauty is that all of the raw edges are completely encased. Now we do know that French seams were sometimes used on garments of the time period, but they weren't particularly common. As a technique to use for assembling a skirt with a sewing machine, I think it's a great idea to use a French seam. I think that it helps keep the allowances free from abrasion on the inside, it protects the raw edge, and it gives us an opportunity to add just a little bit of structure with the second allowance. So now I am running the second gore through the machine to assemble it. And I'm just going to do this pretty quickly here. So you'll see this is my first 1/8 inch pass. And I just run it right through the machine very, very quickly. A little back stitch at the beginning and at the end. And then it is turned to the outside, and then I'll stitch it a second time, and then I will stitch the second piecing of the gore. In Alsega's manual, he talks about piecings and sub-piecings. So in case you were wondering, this is what a sub-piecing looks like. It is a piecing of a piecing, being that the gore itself, the triangle shape, is a piecing to finish out the actual larger piece. So now I'm doing the second pass here of this French seam, and I'm using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance instead of a 1/8 inch seam allowance, and that gives just enough allowance there that I can encase the original bit without any of it sticking out or having to be trimmed off. And once I'm done with this, then I will repeat this process with the second segment of this gore, and then I'll move on to attaching it to the main piece of the skirt. Now, pressing is a very simple affair. We just press it flat once, and then we open it up, and I'm going to point all of the seam allowances downward. And this is just my preference. You can point them all upward as long as you're consistent. It doesn't really matter which direction they go. Now it's time to apply the piecing onto the main body of the skirt. Since this is a French seam, I need to make sure that I stitch the seam to the outside first. So I'm matching up the piece, making sure that it's the right one, and I can see that it is the right sides that are facing me. And then I turn it the correct direction. Always double check, because with French seams, especially if you're working quickly, it's very easy to make a mistake and have it stitched the wrong way, since we're all so tuned to stitching things right sides together versus right sides out. I'm just running this through the machine, doing the first pass, which is 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. It's quite narrow. And then when that's done, I'll, just as before, give a finger press to the seam and then turn the whole thing the other direction and stitch a second time. Now, I don't know if you've noticed this, but I don't like to use pins when I work. I tend to do everything with the special way that I hold my hands, and the fact that my sewing machine is also tuned to the perfect foot pressure, and I'm very familiar with how it works and feels. This machine and I have been working together a very long time, so there's never any doubt to me whether I can stitch this accurately. But now here I've got the seam allowance open, and I am finger pressing it the direction that it needs to go. And then I will fold it over and stitch it a second time. And I have it pressed. I'm using the presser foot to hold it in place while I continue to fiddle with the alignment. And now I'm just running it through the machine, once again using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And this allows the 1/8 seam allowance from the time before to be perfectly encased inside the seam. I apologize for the shaking of the camera. This machine is quite powerful. Okay, just a little bit further, and then it will be done. It's off to the iron to press it. And here we are at the iron doing our initial press. Just working my way down the seam, and this also helps to get rid of my marks. I just press it this way to kind of lock the threads in place, and then I will open it up after turning it, and then I'll press the seam allowances in toward the center, just as though they were darts or any other kind of piecing seam. I will press it toward the center of this panel. And the way I like to do is I'll put the open edge of the fold towards me. That way I can really press down with the iron and use the edge of the iron to sort of shove against the fabrics and pull it tight in the fold. You can even see me trying to tug on the fabric here so that it gets really nice and snug. What I don't want are any folds of fabric being pressed in place that aren't perfectly tight against the stitching. Now I'll just turn the thing around to do the other side, and I'll press that as well. And then we move on. Now that I've gotten both front and back panels completed, I'm putting them together on the tabletop and just double checking the shape. So I'm pulling my pattern out now, and I just want to have a look. And I do this mostly for my own satisfaction, that all the stitching has been done properly. And you can see all of the waistlines are the same and everything looks good. So my next task then is going to be to stitch the side seams. So I can get the pattern out of the way now. Although I need to trim up the hem and just make it blend nicely. Sometimes when you're dealing with piecings, there's a little bit of a discrepancy at the very bottom of it. And this comes from just by virtue of cutting rough seam allowances to piece the 3-section gore that goes in, and you have to trim the hem up to match. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this length tape and I'm going to mark the depth of the opening. I could have done that while I was cutting it out, but I forgot to, so now I'm just marking it with this length tape and getting it ready to sew. Before I sit down and stitch though, I want to cut a little facing here for the side openings of the skirt. And this is just being cut from a scrap of silk that is a couple of finger widths wide, and it's about the same length as the side opening plus 2 dedo. That gives me some seam allowances to work with as I'm positioning it in the opening. Facing the skirt openings is actually a very simple process. We already have a clip in the side seam of the skirt to let us know where that opening is supposed to end. And we have cut our facing strips so that we know they're longer than where that opening needs to be. So what we do then is we have folded the facing strips in half along their length. Sorry, it looks like I have completely lost where my notch is. There we go. I found it. Let me grab one of these here. So what we'll end up doing, see, I've pressed this under so that I can line it right up with that notch, which is where I need the opening to end. And then I just leave the excess hanging out the top. And that just means that I can be very accurate when it comes time to trim. So now I'm going to use my 3/8 inch seam allowance. I'm just going to stitch this all the way down to the bottom and then back stitch again. Here we go. Zoom, zoom, zoom. And as I reach the bottom, I'm just going to very carefully do my back stitch and I'm done. Now, in order for the seam to lie the way I want it to, I am going to put a clip right where the bottom of this is, but I'm going to clip it at an angle. So I'm going to clip it at an angle coming down from the facing area to right where the stitching ends. And we're not going to be squeamish about this clip. We're going to go almost exactly to the stitching. If you don't go all the way to the stitching, you end up having a pucker where that is trying to lie open. So then once this is done, then that double-faced or that doubled silk gets folded to the inside and stitched in place, and that creates the facing. So I will repeat this on the other side and on all 4 of those skirt opening areas, and then I'll come back and sew the side seam. With all of my facings in place now, it's time for us to stitch the side seam. Now, I'm going to stitch this first with right sides facing out because once again, this is a French seam. So yes, we see the facing there, but remember that it will be pressed and folded completely to the inside. So we do have the right side out at this point, and we're going to stitch our 1/8 of an inch seam all the way down. And at one point I have to trim away some excess, but we'll stitch that all the way down and then we will flip it to the other side and stitch it a second time. You can see this area right here doesn't fully match up, so I'm just going to take my snips and I'm going to give it a little blend, just like so. And now I'm ready to keep going. Again, I'm not using pins. I'm just stitching very carefully. The gores in the skirt should line up. And now we're reaching the bottom of the seam. Just with a quick back stitch and a clip, and I'm ready to move on to the next step. First I'll stitch the second side, and then I will turn and move on. Now this skirt is growing very quickly. It's becoming a real life-size actual skirt. So now we've flipped to the other side, and I'm about to do the second pass for the French seams. Now, again, just as before, there's nothing special about how this is done other than it's being turned. It will be stitched at a 1/4 inch seam allowance just to make sure that we've fully encased the 1/8 seam allowance from before. But now that it's getting bigger, there's a lot more handling that's going on. So I'm trying to make sure that I minimize how many times I have to get up from the machine just to be efficient about it. So I'm using my fingers to just roll the seam allowance to where I need it to be. I'm feeling it with my fingers to make sure that I don't have any of the 1/8 inch seam allowance exposed or sticking out. And as I continue down this seam, it gets a little bit more efficient as far as how I hold the fabrics and everything. I won't bore you with watching me stitch every single bit of it, but just know that, you know, the more accurate we are, the more we can finger press this and keep our hands in order, the quicker that the work will go. So we're going to move on here to the next step. And as I sit down to stitch the second pass on the second seam, that brings us to the end of this video. Come join us for the next episode of the Modern Maker Workroom as we demonstrate all of these same techniques with slight variations completely by hand. Then we'll move forward with stiffening the hems and facing the hems and finishing with the waistband. Thank you so much, and as always, happy stitching.